Hello, my name is Dr. Randall Markarian, and I am the 8th District Trustee from Illinois.
And hello, I'm Chad Olson. I'm the Senior Director of State Government Affairs with the American Dental Association, and it's a pleasure to join you today. Dr. Markarian and I are here to talk with you a little bit about a dental loss ratio or a medical loss ratio and a model act from a group called the National Council of Insurance Legislators that you may have heard about. But today we're going to dig into an application of that model and talk about how that can be good for patients and dentists around the country. So without further ado, and Dr. Markarian is going to maybe join me in some of this dialogue, but we're going to just chat through some of the data of applying a model with actual real California reported medical loss ratio data. So before I get started with that, just want to level set on what the concept of a loss ratio is. It is the requirement that a plan pays out a certain percentage of its premium collected in patient care. So an easy way to think about this is if a medical loss ratio is set at 85%, then 85 cents of every dollar that the insurance company collects has to be paid out in patient care. And this is a part of the Affordable Care Act for major medical plans, but dental plans were left out of it. We've been working with the state societies around the country to get medical loss ratio or dental loss ratios set up. And one of the tools in our arrows in our quiver is this model law out of this group called the National Council of Insurance Legislators. And I've one more little note before we get into the data is about that group. The acronym is NCOIL, NCOIL, and it is a bipartisan group of legislators that are very interested in insurance. And one of the things they looked at recently was a dental loss ratio, and they have approved a model law. So let's talk about it. The model law is it has some of those requirements that I talked about, with a requirement that the plans begin reporting, and this is very important, transparency about what goes into the formula for calculating the loss ratio, how much is being paid out in patient care. And there's been a law on the books for about 10 years in California that the plans operating there have to report their data. So you're going to start seeing on your screen a spreadsheet, and this is the data that we're looking at. This is raw data, and we are going to talk through, Dr. Markarian is going to talk through some assumptions we've made with this data. I'm going to talk about one of them briefly, and he'll go into a little more detail about what that really means. But these numbers you're seeing here are the real California data with the assumption that the NCOIL model passed into law in California and became effective in 2019. So you can see at the top of the chart, the data was used in the first year that the law became effective. It's effective in 2019. They're using data from 2017, 2018, and 2019. And the key concept, one of the key concepts in the model, is that a plan that's under a certain trigger medical loss ratio becomes an outlier for not having a high enough medical loss ratio. And you can see there was a company called BCS with a 19.3% medical loss ratio, and that is highlighted for you. That is considered an outlier. And you're going to see this as we go down and look at this screen. We have an average for all the plans that's based on the 3 years, and in this first year, it would be an average of 71.79%. That's also known as a mean for the statisticians out there. And then also part of the model is a standard deviation. This first year of effective date, it would be a standard deviation of 18.95 percentage points, but that's pretty large. And then there is I mentioned this, the trigger MLR. So this is the standard deviation down from the average. The trigger medical loss ratio would be 52.8%. And that's why I called out the 19 percentage point. There's also one that's very low in this first year at 7.2 with Trans-America Life Insurance. So as we continue to look through the data, you can see that there are, in 2020, this is the second year that the law was effective, you can see that BCS has done what we assumed plans might do. And this is what Dr. Markarian is going to get more into, is that these outliers would increase their medical loss ratio successfully to be 3 percentage points above that trigger MLR. So if you recall, that was 52%. So in this scenario, BCS was successful at jumping up to 56% medical loss ratio. And then as we go on to the third year, you can see that they've remained at 56%, and that is at 2021. And that's again based on the previous 3 years. And then I really want to focus the attention of everybody looking at this to the fourth year, because the final part of this assumption was that plans weren't able to maintain that 3 percentage points above. And what would happen if a plan was not able to do that, an outlier? So that 56%, they had it in 2020, 2021, but that was not high enough to remain not an outlier. So they, according to the NCOIL model, would have a specific loss ratio fixed to them, which would be the mean, that average that I talked about earlier. So that is at 2022 for BCS, they would have a medical loss ratio applied to them of 72.2%. And what Dr. Markarian is going to get into is what impact this has on those final numbers that I showed you at the very first year it was effective down at the bottom of the spreadsheet. But what happens to that average? What happens to the standard deviation I talked about? And then what happens to the trigger MLR? So in this first scenario, you could see that the average rose to 72.9%. Importantly, the standard deviation, that's very important for this model, it shrank to 10%. So going from 19 to 10, and then that results in the trigger MLR rising. So those were a lot of numbers, but the basic gist of this is that there will be a rising tide for the plans that are operating. One other thing I'd like to mention about this data is this is real California data. It's from the large group PPO market, in case you're wondering. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Markarian to talk about some of the other scenarios and what we see just been laid out about that basic data down that I was showing you down at the bottom of this chart. Dr. Markarian.
In looking at the different scenarios that we ran, we came up with 4 simulations. And the first simulation had to do with the outliers increasing to 3% over the trigger MLR. And in 22, the outliers must meet the MLR, actual average MLR for 2022. The second scenario was that outliers would increase to 3% over the trigger MLR, and the top performing companies would decrease their MLRs by 5%. The third scenario we ran was outliers would increase to 3% over the trigger MLR, and the plans that were below 20% MLR would just leave the market completely. The final scenario was that outliers would increase their MLRs only to meet the minimum trigger MLR exactly, with no 3% over that trigger MLR number. And as we ran through the simulations, we came up with some interesting results. And in the first set of numbers, we're looking at the first scenario. And we have the MLR average starting in 2019 at 71.8%, and by 2022 increasing to 72.9%. With the trigger MLR starting at 52.8 and increasing 10% to 62.8%. A pretty significant increase in the MLR during that time period. When we look at the standard deviation, just to see how much it's decreased over that period, it started off at 19% and essentially dropped to 10% in the 4 years. Again, a very significant decrease. So while the MLR was increasing, and that helps us out, the standard deviation was cut in half and increased the trigger MLR very significantly during that 4-year time frame. When you go to the second scenario, where the top performers decrease their MLR by 5%, we started off with 71.8% as the mean MLR and ended up at 72.7%. With the trigger MLR going from 52.8 to 63% during the same time frame. Again, another very significant increase in the trigger MLR. And when we view the standard deviation, we start off with the 19% standard deviation, and it drops below 10% to 9.8% in that 4-year time frame. So even with top performers making a slight decrease in their MLR, the overall trigger MLR is increasing significantly during that 4-year period.
And Dr. Markarian, on that point, one of the reasons we ran this scenario was because there is some concern out there that the plans, the top performing plans may drop. And so we wanted to make sure we ran a scenario that incorporates that. But, I think you would agree, I think, that the plans also have market forces that would drive them to maintain a good medical loss ratio. So while we ran the scenario, we're not exactly sure the plans would behave this way, but we wanted to get those numbers.
Right. And I agree, Chad. I think that they are in a competitive market with other dental benefit companies, and having a high MLR certainly would be a point of that they would use with potential employers to purchase their plans. So I agree. I think it's less likely that they would drop it, but it is considering all possibilities. And I think that's important in what we do, is to look at all the possibilities. And moving on to the next one, the next possibility is that the plans below 20% MLR leave the market completely. And so again, we start off with our 71.8 MLR, and that increases to 73.6% during this 4-year period. But the trigger MLR increases from 52.8 up to 63.9, almost 64%. Again, a very significant increase in a short amount of time, with the standard deviation dropping from 19% to 9.7% during that period. So we see a tightening of the market in all these scenarios.
Yeah, and on that one, Dr. Markarian, what I think was interesting was we've seen some of this activity in Massachusetts
Correct.
with news stories about plans leaving. So we wanted to make sure that that was also a scenario we incorporated. We've also seen plans being willing to come into the market in Massachusetts, which we also, want to emphasize that, again, going to the free market issue, we think that plans, though there may be some that for business reasons or what have you want to leave, there are others that will take up the slack. But the final point I would make is, if plans do elect to leave, you saw even a greater shrinking of that standard deviation.
I think the decrease in the standard deviation is really significant no matter what the scenario. And even when we get to our final scenario, where the companies, the outliers only go to the trigger MLR exactly, we still see an increase in the mean from 71.8 to 72.7, and in the trigger one standard deviation below from 52.8 to 63 even. So no matter what the scenario, we are seeing a significant increase in the trigger MLR. And I want to confront this head on. I know that some people are going to say that, the medical side is 80 or 85%, and that the numbers that have been thrown around on dental are in that range. And while these are below, these are significant improvements from where we are today, with no MLR laws, with no enforcement, with no reason for the insurance companies to make any changes in their behavior. It moves everything in the right direction. And even more importantly, it brings us the data that we need in order to analyze what the insurance companies are doing. At this point, we really, other than the California data, have no idea what's happening on the dental benefit industry around the nation. So to have widespread, transparent data that we can analyze will help us out to better understand where the MLR should effectively be at some point in the future.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think the NCOIL model, it is as I mentioned this earlier, it's a rising tide scenario, and for everybody that's looked at this data on this video with us today, you can see that there's this constant upward pressure that's being created, no matter what the scenario is. And at some point, it may be that if a state were to enact something using the rubric that NCOIL sets up, the dental plans cry uncle and say, okay, we're ready for an actual loss ratio to be set for us. And the other point I'd make, and I think that's why the NCOIL model itself is such a great tool for the state societies to potentially use. some in states that weren't even going to consider this in the near future, but now that can, is the concession that the dental plans make in saying that at some point it's appropriate for a loss ratio to be set.
Mhm.
And that's what the NCOIL model really, that's the key point. So we're supporting state societies that are seeking a loss ratio, whether it's a fixed one, somewhere in the 80s. A lot of the state societies are out there seeking that, but also supporting our state societies that may want to use the NCOIL model to get this issue moving for patients in their states.
And we've already heard from states that knew they would be unable to do an MLR type bill with a set number, and now they have the possibility of being able to enact a law that has transparent data sharing, that also allows for enforcement, and opens up the possibility of more states being able to provide an MLR type law. I think that the data is the most important part of this and can't be overlooked. We have been in the dark about what the dental benefit companies have done. And now having data, or being able to have the data in the future, will allow us to better analyze what they're doing, and to be able to fine tune our arguments at each state level to fine tune their MLR legislation going forward. This is not a static one time, here's the NCOIL language, we're done with it. This is something that will be a whole new arena of information for us to use and to be able to exploit in the future, in deciding how to pursue different state laws.
It's a great point, Dr. Markarian. I just want to say thank you to everybody for listening to our information about the California data and the modeling. As you can see, there's a lot of positives that could occur if you use, or if a state sets up a rubric like the NCOIL model, just emphasizing it as a tool for the state societies to use and a springboard for further action as we work to advance this issue and others to the benefit of patients and the dentists that serve them.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for listening to the webinar. It's very important that we have an understanding of MLR, because this is valuable, useful legislation for states to utilize in achieving dental insurance reform. I would like for everyone, if you have more questions, go to ada.org/DLR to get the most up-to-date information on the DLR issue. And honestly, I think the most important thing is for my fellow dentists is to get involved. Go to your local component, say what you think, get your opinions out there, become part of the solution. That's the only way we can make change. That's how we're going to move things like MLR forward and other reforms that need to happen. So please become an active participant in the American Dental Association. Thank you very much for listening, and let's do some great things together.